Have you ever been to Dauphin Island? Have you ever been to Gulf Shores? If you've been to either one of those locations, the Battle of Mobile Bay took place right between the two. Between those 2 points, here is a map. You see Dauphin Island right here, and if you look at the Google Earth version, it's right here. Mobile is right here about where the B is. So if you come on down to Dauphin Island and you go down to this point right here to the east end, on that very end, you will find Fort Gaines. This is a Civil War fort. It was built during this time period. And likewise, if you go across the bay and down the highway to Gulf Shores, and then come on down to the west end, the very tip, you will find the other Civil War fort, Fort Morgan. And there's a photograph of it after the Battle of Mobile Bay. It had been bombed out pretty good. But in between these two is an opening into Mobile Bay. And what happened here is that the North was trying to block off the entrance to this bay so that the Confederate ships couldn't get supplies up to Mobile into the bay. It was called a blockade. And so we can look at this map right here. It's color coded. Of course, the red, I believe, is the south and the blue is the north. You can see all of the different ships, and the arrows tell you how they were lining up and where they went and how they progressed in order to make this battle happen. But here are the two commanders. On the north side, we had Admiral Farragut, United States Navy, Admiral David Farragut. And on the south side, we had Confederate States Navy, Admiral Franklin Buchanan. So he was leading the battle from the south side. And the battle took place and the firing began and things got really smoky and it was hard to see. And Admiral Farragut was determined to see through the smoke. He wanted to see what was happening, if his maneuvers were working out. And he actually climbed the rigging so that he could see. And the captain of the ship actually got so bothered that the admiral would put himself at risk like that he ordered one of the sailors to go up there and tie Admiral Farragut to the rigging so that he wouldn't fall, to because that was high up. He was going up very high, and the admiral let him do it. And then he actually moved to a different location, and the sailor had to tie him up again to the rigging so that he wouldn't fall. But he got to see through, and eventually, of course, the North won the Battle of Mobile Bay, and then they went up and took over Mobile. They stopped any supplies from coming into Mobile. And this is just a short clip on the battle. It was the 150th anniversary not too long ago of the Battle of Mobile Bay. And this is just a Fox 10 news clip. You can click on that at your leisure. I have to save time on my recording, but that's going to be in my original PowerPoint. So click on that to see more about the Battle of Mobile Bay. Another admiral from Mobile. Oh, I forgot I was telling you in there that's how he kept himself from falling. On the next one, another famous admiral during the Civil War is our own Admiral Raphael Semmes. The reason we have a community named Semmes, we have a hotel downtown named Semmes, and then of course we have this statue, he's green and he's down there by the Explorium, and that's our Admiral Semmes, and his house is on Government Street. You still pass by it. He was when he wasn't being in the Navy, he was a lawyer by trade. But in 1861, he resigned. He was, at the time, he was in the Navy, but he resigned from the U.S. Navy and joined the Confederate Navy. And he was put in charge of a ship called the Sumter. And then he was later put on a ship called the CSS Alabama. Now, we have a USS Alabama that's out in the bay, but back during the Civil War, we had one called the CSS Alabama, and it was a wooden ship. And Admiral Semmes would use it to to raid other supply ships. He was very good. It was kind of like he was kind of like a pirate, but in charge. But he was being paid by the Confederate Navy, and he would get those supplies to help the Confederacy. And he had just completed 5 very successful raids when it was time to have the ship, um, you know, fixed back up again. And so he decided to dock it in France. That was considered a safe place. And so he was in France getting the CSS Alabama repaired when the USS, the United States Kearsarge ship, which had been chasing the Alabama for 2 years on the seas, trying to stop it. The Kearsarge had been looking for it, and they found out that the CSS Alabama was in a port in France. And so what they did is they couldn't go into that port and start a war, carry our Civil War onto France's waters. So they had to wait until the Alabama came out into the Atlantic Ocean again in order to try to chase it back down. And that's what they did. And so they waited until the Alabama came out into the Atlantic, and they got into a battle, and the Alabama did get sunk right there off the coast of Cherbourg, France. uh, Admiral Sims was able to abandon ship. A British ship came to get him and took him to safety, and that, of course, made the Union Navy mad. But he did get to safety. And the interesting thing is that those the ship's remains were down at the bottom of the ocean for all these years. But in 1984, a minesweeper was going up and down the waters and located a sunken, a shipwreck. And when the divers went down, they found out that it was the CSS Alabama. And so France and the United States went back and forth battling over who was going to get, who was going to be credited for finding the shipwreck or for getting the artifacts off of it. And they battled back and forth, and finally they agreed they would share the credit and recover those artifacts and share them. And in our own history museum in downtown Mobile, we have several of those artifacts. The ship's bell is there, guns, the cannon, as you can see in this photograph right here, there's the cannon was recovered. Part of the ship's structure, some furniture, tableware. They found believe it or not, it was a beautiful toilet. It was blue and white porcelain. They found the toilet. In 2004, a human jawbone was even found under a gun that was, and that jawbone was buried here in Mobile. But you can go to our history museum and see all of that, and that's really neat. So check that out if you can when it opens back up. Now, like I was saying earlier, the Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest. I put this same battle casualty chart up here for you to see. 51,000 men died that day on that land, and so they all had to be buried, and that's what happened. So President Lincoln gave a speech on November 19th in 1863, just 4 months or so after the battle, and people would come to hear speakers because they didn't have they had newspapers, but they didn't have video or audio, and if the actual person was coming to talk, people would flock to hear real speakers. And President Lincoln was not the actual main speaker that day. It was another man. And people were known to speak for 2 hours or so on a topic. And the people that came to listen would stand. They wouldn't bring lawn chairs and listen. They wouldn't have chairs, but they would stand and listen to the person speak. And the person that spoke right before Abraham Lincoln had spoken for about 2 hours, and they were expecting President Lincoln to do about the same. But as I said earlier, he knew words, and he knew how to use words to say powerful things in as few words possible. And that is what he did in the Gettysburg Address. It was only 271 words and lasted just a few minutes. However, it has gone down as one of the best known speeches in American history. So the Gettysburg Address was given that day And here it is. And I only I bolded the most memorable parts. People have actually memorized the entire Gettysburg Address, but this is the 407 years ago. Here's our 4 score. So 87 years ago, that's how he begins. 87 years ago, our fathers, that's our John Adams and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and those men, brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And then he goes on to finish it, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And so those are the most memorable words from the Gettysburg Address. And if you click on this link, that tells you more about the Gettysburg Address. So that is it for today's lesson. I will get back to you tomorrow. We're starting to get down towards the end of the war and find out what actually happens with Abraham Lincoln in the end.